everybody to a panel on Earth is changing the game. We have an excellent group of panelists with us today. Jeremy Levine from Draft, Nik Bonaddio from numberFire, David Geller from DailyMVP, Howard Kamen from Gannett Digital Ventures, myself from, I welcome you all today. Each of you to start off by discussing the companies that you work with and how you in particular fit within the daily fantasy sports landscape. Let's start with you, Jeremy Levine.
Cool. So I run a company called Draft. Draft is a mobile game, very much like Words with Friends for fantasy. We used to run a company called Star Street, which was a direct competitor to DraftKings and FanDuel. And we sold that to DraftKings recently and moved on to kind of go all in on building Draft. Draft kind of very quick, simple head-to-head drafts, really trying to build a casual game that kind of any sports fan can play. So right now there's about 1 million daily fantasy sports players. There's something around 40 million fantasy players, and there's about 200 million sports fans in America and Canada. Really want to build a game that all 200 million sports fans can play and play with confidence.
And Nik, before we head to you, for everybody that's listening in and watching us today, if you want to be involved, please use the hashtag on Twitter, SportsConf, C-O-N-F, and we'll be looking at any questions, and I will make sure that the panelists respond to it. So Nik, tell us a little bit about yourself and the company you work with.
So yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of numberFire. So what numberFire does is, we provide a resource for anyone who plays daily fantasy or just as a sports fan in general. We provide projections, data services into different kinds of daily fantasy games like Draft and like top line games. We also provide a lot of different content and projections on numberFire.com. So you can just think of us as basically a sports analytics resource in which, whether you're a sports fan, daily fantasy player, March Madness, whatever it is you do, you can come to numberFire.com and get the information you need.
And David, you're directly involved in the daily fantasy space. Tell us a little bit about DailyMVP.
Sure. So can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So Top Line Game Labs launched DailyMVP, which is our consumer fantasy sports brand, and really similar to what Jeremy was referring to, appealing to more casual sports fans as well as fantasy sports fans. So sort of lowering the bar of complexity around games so that on a daily, in a daily space, casual fans can actually participate and follow along with the games they're going to check that night. So really looking at something that's quick, mobile-based, and casual to play.
And finally, Howard, tell us a little bit about how Gannett entered the daily fantasy.
Yeah, so
space.
Sure. So this is Howard, and so I work for Gannett Digital Ventures, but I do a lot of work with USA Today as well, and I have an editorial background there. Now have moved over to the kind of the business side, working with content licensing and syndication, and I've been working with the USA Today fantasy sports team in kind of consulting them on a new game that a daily game that we've debuted in the fall called Fantasy Score, and also kind of transitioning, helping to transition that group into a bigger fantasy, have a bigger fantasy presence within USA Today itself. So we're, I guess, an example of a kind of a bigger media company that has finally dipped its toe into the daily fantasy space.
So I think a good place for us all to start is to talk about this new daily fantasy. It is still somewhat new, even though fantasy sports in general has existed for beyond 10 years. You have this daily fantasy sports space that has received an influx of capital, many investments from venture capital firms, angel investors, etc. And we've seen this space grow a lot and change in recent years. Maybe starting with you, Jeremy, where do you see the direction of this industry going, and what enticed you to create your new app, Draft? How is it different from the existing landscape?
So I'm obviously insanely bullish on kind of daily fantasy. I see it going up and up and up and up. This NFL season just kind of really showed the potential for it. I know that both FanDuel and DraftKings are kind of two mammoth players in the space, the two best and biggest daily fantasy companies. They both way exceeded their projections, like 3, 4, 5x their projections for this NFL season. I heard a guy on one of their boards recently say that in August they kind of were projecting this market as a $5 billion market. They now think it's a $20 billion market. The growth kind of every year, I think, has exceeded anyone's expectations. So I think there's just a huge market here. Obviously, FanDuel and DraftKings are kind of very well entrenched with what they're doing now, and both have great potential. I think you'll see both those companies probably raise funding at near or above $1 billion valuation coming before kind of next football season. What I saw from my space is I think those companies fighting to be kind of number 3 with those companies doing the same thing is a tough battle right now. That's kind of the position we were in with Star Street, but we were just way more excited about some other opportunities and other platforms, and really mobile, right? No one had really ever built a fantasy game for mobile, and mobile is obviously just a massive platform. Really think there's an opportunity to build still a daily or for football weekly game with real money elements for the masses, something that isn't really a hardcore game, right? If you think of DraftKings and FanDuel, it's a pretty hardcore game. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. It's a tough thing to do a draft there from your iPhone, from your Android phone. And we really felt like building an experience that people could play kind of quickly, easily, whenever they wanted on their phone is something that hundreds of millions of people could even play.
And we're talking about hundreds of millions of people in this space, and I'm interested, and I know that we already have one question, which asks about what kind of inroads have been made in the Latino-Hispanic demographic, but also maybe you can take it a step further. What's the breakdown in male-female involvement, and maybe compare it to what the traditional fantasy sports landscape looks like, as opposed to this growing daily fantasy sports sector. Nick, David, is this something that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of speak to it. The demographics are interesting in the sense that, we look at it, so unlike Jeremy and unlike David, I'm more like Howard in the sense that we provide content to people who are playing these games. So we're a little bit looking at from a different perspective. One common maxim that I hear a lot is that I think a lot of people think that if they can figure out a way to bring these underserved markets like women and like Latino Hispanic markets or even the Asian markets into daily fantasy, which has traditionally been a very homogenous white male market, that they'll be very well served. And conceptually with that I agree, but it's one of those things where I'm not quite sure how you would market or position a product to be specifically towards one of those markets. I think your better bet, and going back to what Jeremy alluded to, is to not necessarily target a smaller market in terms of like, okay, I'm going after women or going after the Latino Hispanic market or whatever, but go after the more casual player. Because Jeremy's exactly right that building a number 3 to DraftKings or FanDuel, that's not going to happen. You can't compete with them in terms of their marketing reach, just the time to market reach. They're ahead of the game by 3-4 years. You're not going to chip away at what they've got. What you have to do is figure out a way to go at the casual player in a more approachable way, give them content and give them tools that feels like that they've got an advantage or they can hit the ground running. And somewhat interestingly, I think Dave can speak to this a lot as well. There is a lot of opportunity for fantasy sports to spread out beyond just sports. Create fantasy games and create casual games that move beyond just a football game and move it to something like the Oscars or the Grammys or something like that. And I'll just segue that right over to Dave.
I completely agree with what Nick and Jeremy are talking about. I think that with FanDuel and DraftKings, they do a great job with the game format that they offer and the style of contest that they run. But I'd sort of position them more as the sort of early adopters, the more hardcore fantasy sports players. As a game format itself, when I was at Yahoo, salary cap was the least popular of our fantasy sports game formats. And in particular, with the growing sort of casual audience in the season-long fantasy sports games, there wasn't really anyone gravitating towards salary cap as the format that they enjoyed. And so I think that, while it works very well for what FanDuel and DraftKings are doing, that when you look to broaden sort of and democratize the fantasy sports audience, you really need to look at mobile and casual-based games, particularly for a daily game. And I think that's where the bigger opportunity is for new entrants into the market is exactly what Jeremy was referring to, is not to try to compete to be number 3 against 2 companies that have, 5-year lead time, a lot of learnings under their belt, a lot of expertise in the style of contest that they run, but look at, the market from a different perspective, is that it will grow beyond that early adopter hardcore audience, and what is the right product suite to offer more casual fantasy fans or casual sports fans. And to the point of women playing or different demographics, at Yahoo we saw growth in the season long, particularly in fantasy football. Women participating, about 10, 15 years ago was more in the 3 to 4% range. It grew to at least 12, 13% in the last few years. And I see that if the games are casual and fun on the daily space, there's no reason that wouldn't also appeal to casual sports fans, whether they're male or female. So I think it's a little early to start being too targeted in sort of a niche market, but that if you create a product that is appealing and easy to use and most importantly fun, then it'll appeal to a really broad audience.
Just to chime in quick, there was some data. When we were Star Street, we probably had maybe 5 women playing in total. With Draft now, we're over 20% female in kind of the users we've seen so far playing.
So talking about the numbers too, just real quick. So I have actually some research that I'm on the board of directors of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, and we recently just had our conference in Las Vegas about a month ago. And some of the numbers that we heard from some of our panelists there were that you have, not to probably anybody's surprise here, but you have a 90%, approximately 90% white audience basically playing fantasy sports as a whole. What we also heard was that it was closer to 95%, or actually 95% male on the daily fantasy side, where it's more about 80% male on the kind of more traditional. One thing I'd say, directing to the question specifically about more Latino audience, is one of the states where we're having some issues in the legalization of fantasy sports is Arizona, and maybe if we are working in that area and in the other states that where there's still some question about the status of fantasy sports, that would bring in more players of more backgrounds too.
So I think it's interesting. One major takeaway thus far, it seems, from the panelists is that you've got this two-headed monster in FanDuel and DraftKings that have really taken a major share and a lot of investment, and that a lot of the startups looking to get into the space should not look at them as competitors, but instead try to create their own ecosystems that are very far. And different question that I have based on that is, it's hard to look at those two and not recognize the immense number of partnerships that they've created with individual athletes, with teams, and also with leagues, the NFL being the only major professional sports league in the United States that has not yet aligned itself or DraftKings. Is it a concern then, even if you're not directly in competition with those two, that you may be excluded from those types of partnerships based on some sort of exclusive language? And maybe you can also touch upon the value or maybe the lack of value in the partnerships that have been created with these variety of teams, leagues, etc. I guess, David Geller, let's start with you.
Muted here. I think a lot of what you're seeing with DraftKings and FanDuel's relationships with the leagues and with the teams is really creating awareness and legitimacy.
Exactly.
I think that particularly because of their game format and the style of contest that they're offering, it's going to be hard for them to cross over into a casual fan who happens to go to a game and sees the signage for FanDuel or DraftKings to, you know, get over the barrier to get that person into those contests and playing on a regular basis, I think is going to be difficult. I think it definitely establishes some legitimacy for the players that they already have, or the hardcore people that they're going to attract. I think what's more interesting with the teams is that, you know, particularly for, you know, other entrants into the market outside of FanDuel and DraftKings, is to look at more creative ways in which you can work with the teams. We're launching a team-based game actually tonight with the Washington Capitals, but the game concept and the experience is really built around the fans and the fans following the game that night. So, you know, the game we're offering is a fantasy game that's strictly based on the Capitals players playing in the game tonight, for their fans to sort of dip their toe into what is casual fantasy sports. And the team, you know, becomes a partner then for us. They'll do the promotion, and we've created a relationship in which they're actually incentivized to promote the game and get their fans involved, versus just the court signage and the awareness. I think that's just an additional marketing spend for DraftKings and FanDuel to, you know, have their brand in front of a wide audience, which makes perfect sense. But I don't see that, you know, sort of leading to a mass amount of growth for their user base. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next year or two as they really lock up exclusivity with either the leagues or teams.
Yeah, I think David's right. Sorry, just kind of hop in real quick. So in my mind, there's very different value between getting a team involved and getting a player involved, right? So when you get the players and the teams, the leagues themselves involved, that's very strong social proof. That's credibility. That's just saying, hey, it's okay for you as a fan to get involved in this industry, to play the games, because we endorse it, we support it. On the player side, you know, going back to a bunch of different VC-backed companies, you know, there's definitely a trend in the startup world to getting different celebrities involved in your startup, whether it's, you know, I think Shoe Dazzle was a Kim Kardashian company. There was a company called Two Society, which was a men's lifestyle brand, which had Nas and Blake Griffin involved and so on. There's very, in my mind, limited returns to getting individual players involved, because there's a very weak correlation between your favorite athlete telling you to do something or endorsing something and having you do it. You know, there's much lesser value on that end that I've seen, and much stronger value in getting teams involved, getting leagues involved, and so on. So I think David is definitely right. There's a lot of really cool things to do on the team level within, you know, individual teams, with in-game experiences, with, you know, taking the approach that fantasy football was really one of the best things that's ever happened to football in general, because all it really does is serve to make sure that people watch games they otherwise wouldn't watch. I would never watch Arizona versus Buffalo unless I had maybe Larry Fitzgerald on my roster. And so when you get people talking about the games and being involved in the games and playing games that sit on top of the actual games themselves, it only serves to serve the best interests of the leagues themselves. So it makes sense for leagues to get involved. I would hesitate to really state there's a lot of value in getting the players themselves involved.
I look at it, this is Howard, I look at it as a complete positive. Because of all, you know, what David had said, the legitimacy piece of it. But what's good for each company is really good for the industry as a whole. And so the inroads that those companies have made, great for them, but also good for everybody else that's either just starting off in the industry, or, you know, has a more established brand perhaps and is now trying to get into this space. So I think it's very positive all the way around.
I want to touch on something that Howard had mentioned earlier, and I was having a little bit of problem, at least on my end, hearing it because it was a little choppy. But I believe Howard brought up the issue of legalization and how it varies from state to state, and I also believe that Arizona was mentioned in particular. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about the current situation state to state. Which states have actually outwardly said we're not going to allow daily fantasy sports or fantasy sports in general when there's some sort of compensation involved? And where do we see the regulation going forward? And could there potentially be states actually putting in place taxation measures in order to try to get some money for their own state budgets from fantasy itself?
So maybe I can tackle that one to start off with. So there's generally considered about 5 or 6 states where it's unclear that fantasy sports is legal, and a lot of companies that produce their games do not allow people who play from those states to win prizes. So we're talking about Arizona, we're talking about Iowa, we're talking about Louisiana, we're talking about Montana, we're talking about Washington State, and in some cases Kansas. Those are the 5 or 6 states. What we've tried to do from the Fantasy Sports Trade Association side is lobby in those states. And what you're going to be seeing this year, hopefully, are a handful of bills that are going to be introduced into the state legislatures in those states to try to force through essentially a fantasy sports legalization bill. We were able to accomplish that in the state of Maryland about 2-3 years ago, and right now there's bills that are in place in Kansas, in Iowa, and we have tried some efforts in Arizona. What we're being blocked by in those states essentially are casinos or gambling operations that go on there. In Arizona, it's a lot of the tribal gaming organizations that have presented some issues for us. But I think what we're seeing is, everybody else is, the numbers are going up. All the things that we've been talking about here today show that, what the popularity is. And I think that within the next 4 or 5 years, hopefully that's a long-term projection, but within the next couple of years, we will have that legalization. One thing that we've just started, and I'm not sure if folks are aware of it or not, if you would go to a website called fantasysportsfreedom.com, all one word, fantasysportsfreedom.com. It's a grassroots effort that the FSTA, kind of in conjunction with some of its member companies, have out there to try to. It's a grassroots effort essentially to try to focus on those states that I just mentioned, to try to get people to reach out to their to try to get some of these bills passed. So I do think that we're going to see some progress there. We're hearing that the congressmen themselves in the states are playing. So if they're playing themselves, fantasy sports, then what's the holdup? So it's just a matter of getting over that hurdle. And I think once one of these states falls, the rest of them will as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that when we first did our first legal survey at Yahoo, when we were going to introduce season-long cash games, I think initially there were 36 states that we were approved to enter into. Now that's grown to 45 just in the last few years. And from, anecdotally what we hear is that in the states where there's still, some questioning and there's sort of more conservative approach to not being in those states, it really has to do with what Howard was referring to as competing interests, whether it's casinos, the tribal casinos, and so on. Not so much the argument that these games are not games of skill. And I think that as education occurs and as legislators become more familiar with what these games truly are, and then couple that with the ability to generate revenue for the state from taxes, it makes even more sense that these games should be opened up in all states.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem we're running into is, if you listen to what just David said, like he said that a lot of the competition is coming from gambling and tribal-related interests. Well, all of us in the DFS industry have to be good actors in the sense that we have to stop using gambling terms as we talk about our games. We have to minimize that kind of connection. The more we talk about things like rake and things like, all these other terms that indicate a connection, even though there isn't one, between gambling and daily fantasy, the more that confusion gets generated, the more those comparisons, get made with people. It's something that all of us who are in the industry have to be good actors and stop using those terms, stop making games which are a little bit too close to that gray area. Because anyone who's ever played DFS knows that there isn't really any connection between gambling and DFS. It's unilaterally a game of skill. So all of us need to sort of move off of that language and move off of that mentality where people can draw those correlations between gambling and DFS.
So obviously there's the fantasy football that has made people watch games, including the Arizona Cardinals that they wouldn't watch otherwise. There's fantasy baseball that has existed for years and years, fantasy basketball, etc. But outside of the big four sports, what areas are emerging and do you think will become very popular in daily fantasy sports in the future?
I mean, one thought, if you take it outside of potentially outside of the United States in terms of sports, English Premier League, soccer is I think a natural fit just because of the way the game structure is. You're seeing a lot more European companies get involved. So that leads you to think, if it does spread, it could be beyond soccer, it could be cricket, it could be rugby, those type of sports, I would think.
One I'm most excited about, I think, is golf. Just saw DraftKings announce a $2.2 million first place tournament for golf. We're going to be launching golf with the Masters. That's something that the last year, in terms of kind of play I've seen on other daily fantasy websites, way exceeded my expectations.
And going away from the sports question, and this is probably better focused toward Howard and Nick, what particular companies or platforms do you see as real up-and-comers in the daily fantasy space?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I like a lot of what Jeremy and David are doing for sure. I think the move into casual is the right move, and as a business owner, I'm happy to work with them. I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a lot of innovation in this space, in the sense that, like I said before, people know that they just can't go up against FanDuel and DraftKings on their terms, on their games, and compete. So I think Victive is doing some cool things around their Victron, which is an AI kind of game where you're competing up against a computer. I think you'll see a lot of cool things like that. And I would also say that I think you're going to see 4 or 5 entrants in the next 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. Just as this market expands, it's going to be creating a lot of interest from the big companies, the ESPNs of the world, the Yahoos of the world, and it's also going to create a lot of entrepreneurs come out of MIT or come out of CMU or Harvard who have cool ideas and want to create games. And I think it's going to be a very interesting and perhaps turbulent next couple of years in our industry.
You have and Nick just kind of brought it up. You have a lot of people who are in school now, who are getting out of school, who have played fantasy for perhaps their whole lives.
Right.
Okay, where for maybe some of us who might be a little bit older, we've been playing maybe 20 years or less. You have people who this is what they know. They've grown up playing this with maybe their parents or friends, and so there's a lot of possibilities for the future. In terms of platforms, it's essentially you need to be where everybody is, right? So you have to style your game to be at whatever that next technology is. So if we're going to be having watches coming out soon and different glassware, things like that, then you need to have your game there and be prepared to be where the people are. I think that's at the end of the day. One other area, we've talked about games per se, but there's the content development piece of it as well, and the content creation piece. And there will be companies that specialize. Maybe they're not going to go in the gaming side, but they're going to be in the area of providing the content for players to be playing every day. So I think that's an important piece as well.
And maybe a question better focused for Jeremy and David. Obviously, you've seen an influx of capital from a variety of venture capitalists, angel investors, et cetera. Do you see this trend continuing? Is it going to become even more aggressive? Or maybe we'll have some of these potential investors pull back? What do you see with regards to the financial scene?
It's continuing, no doubt. You'll see, I mean, I said this earlier, FanDuel will probably raise $100 million or so round. DraftKings, I assume, will do the same. There's going to be a lot more money coming into this industry.
Yeah, I agree. I think there'll be a lot more investment over the next few years, and I think it'll probably get sort of smarter money invested, where the investments aren't going to be solely for marketing purposes, but for developing interesting technology that can sort of appeal and catch on a little bit more organically. But nonetheless, because of the projected growth in this space, and if it parallels anything similar to what we saw in the season-long games, there will certainly be a lot more investment and smarter investment over the next couple of years.
to any of the panelists, do you see daily fantasy sports being in competition with the more traditional fantasy offerings? And there has been some mention of a Yahoo or an ESPN getting involved in daily fantasy sports. How far off are we from having a Yahoo or an ESPN really get involved? And will it be through an acquisition of an existing daily fantasy sports company, or do you think they're going to create their product from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, I say this with the caveat that I know absolutely nothing about what they're actually talking about, so don't take, like, I'm not an insider on either one of these companies at all. I think it's very unlikely that either ESPN or Yahoo will actually get into the gaming side of it, the actual platform side of it, simply because, I mean, they're already years behind, and the kind of cost they would have to outlay in terms of hiring engineers and everything else, it's just way too prohibitive. They're making so much money on the advertising side from the FanDuels and the DraftKings buying advertising space on ESPN and Yahoo and so on. And to me, it's unlikely they'll get into the actual gaming side of it. Speaking of the acquisition market, I mean, to acquire a company like FanDuel or DraftKings, you're going to have to shell out either north of $1 million or north of $1 billion or something close to it. That's a very, very big nut to crack, especially on ESPN's side, which is owned by Disney. Doesn't seem like they have something they get into. Yahoo, going back to your first question about whether or not it cannibalizes the season-long market, I don't think it does. I think that, I can speak for myself that my season-long habits really haven't changed. I think the Venn diagram just kind of sits right inside of it, and it doesn't really have, like, pulling people off of any season-long games. So I don't think that that's much of a worry. I think the concern, if I'm a large company like a Fox or a Yahoo, is that do we outlay this cost to go build something, or do we just sit back and take in the advertising dollars and just let it grow and grow with it in that capacity, which is, I think, probably what they're going to end up doing.
I mean, a couple thoughts on that. You could argue that the ESPNs of the world are already in the daily fantasy space because of all the advertising that's going on there, right? So they might not have a game, and for the reasons that Nick was saying, but they're already kind of in the space because of all the ads. I mean, when you're listening on the radio even or watching on TV, every third ad it seems is for maybe a FanDuel or a DraftKings. A couple numbers too, just from some other research. I was quoting some numbers earlier. I think it's the numbers that were quoted was 80. I think it was 83% of people who are season-long players are also, or 83% are in the season-long space as well as the daily space. Okay. And that the number of people overall that are playing daily fantasy is only, was it like 2% of all players? So there's massive growth there. So I don't see it one cannibalizing the other too much.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see a lot of cannibalization. I think that again, if you look at sort of the trends, the sort of casual fans that have migrated towards season-long fantasy football, will be even further behind the early adopters in the daily space. So I think that the season-long games won't be impacted tremendously from daily, but I think that the daily has huge opportunities in non-football sports, in particular with basketball, baseball, and hockey, where you'll see a lot more growth in the daily space for those sports versus the fact that they've been fairly stagnant from a growth perspective in the season-long games. Right. So again, I'm never going to give up my season-long, hockey game, but I will start playing the daily games, or I already have, obviously, and I can see casual fans and hockey fans that don't want to commit to the 6-month fantasy hockey season discovering daily and making that a part of their life. So I don't see it being cannibalistic of the season-long games as they are right now.
Yeah, agree. And just I fumbled over that number before. I was just taking a look. I think it is 83% of daily fantasy players are playing season-long is what I was trying to say. So, but yeah, I completely agree with what David was saying.
All right. Well, we're running a little bit low on time, and definitely I thank each and every one of you for participating. And I want to leave off with this one question about the future of daily fantasy. And obviously we don't know what it's going to look like 5-10 years from now, but let's talk about the next 12 to 18 months. how do you see the daily fantasy space evolving? And what do you think the ecosystem will look like a year from now as compared to today? Jeremy, let's start with you.
It's just going to be bigger and bigger. I think you'll see about FanDuel and DraftKings part with over 80% of the teams in the 4 major sports. I think you'll see definitely one of them, if not both, at billion-dollar valuations. And I think you'll see a game like ours, a kind of game on mobile, really taking off and getting a lot of traction next football season. I think you'll see a lot of the big kind of media and content players try to make plays in the space and kind of try to. I think this past year, this past football season, a lot of them woke up and realized this is something we need to get into. And they're going to kind of make a play. I think right now they've set their direction. They're going to make a play this football season. Maybe some work. My guess is most don't work, and a lot of them go back to the drawing board kind of mid-football season, realizing they need to take a different approach and maybe a more content-focused approach.
Yeah, what I was going to say, very, very similar, that more growth, more companies involved. The start of the NFL season is when you'll begin seeing it, because that's obviously the biggest the sport. I haven't really seen much as the baseball season, as spring training is getting going here. I haven't really seen a lot. Maybe we'll see a couple there, but I think you're going to see it in the NFL season. I don't know if we're going to be that much different, except bigger, a year from now. What I would hope that we would see, though, is that a couple of the states that we've talked about will have passed legislation by then to open up the market to even more players.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that I'm really interested in seeing is, I think I think Jeremy is right that both FanDuel and DraftKings are going to raise a lot of VC money at a very high valuation to, one, sort of give credibility to the marketplace, but two, really set expectations for at some point there being a big outcome in our industry, whether it's an IPO or a very large acquisition. I think one sort of interesting sub-trend that's going on is sort of the rise of the DFS celebrity. So, on one hand, on the content side, you're going to have people sort of emerging as the Matthew Berry of DFS, as the voice of, the advice and sort of the content side of it. And on the other side, you're going to have guys who are hardcore DFS players, the Peter Jennings of the world, the Drew Dinkmeyers of the world, who are going to become the equivalent of poker celebrities, of notable people who, are, it's a niche industry in a sense, but they're going to be sort of, notable celebrities in the space. I also think that, sort of alluding to what Jeremy said, that you're going to have these large media companies, the ESPNs, the Yahoos of the world, getting much more into content serving the DFS players. I think that's going to manifest itself in some interesting M&A transactions in the next 1 to 2 years. There's a lot of good companies writing a lot of good content. Roto Grinders definitely comes to mind. numberFire,
yeah, good example,
is another one. So I think that there's going to be a lot of sort of interesting movements as sort of these large media companies come to decisions of how they're going to market and write content and get after the DFS fan. I'm sure ESPN and Yahoo and these other legacy companies realize that people are going somewhere else to get their DFS advice and content and so on. So I think there's going to be some interesting M&A transactions in the next 1 to 2 years. I think you're going to have a bit of a bloodbath of a lot of the also-rans, sort of like the 6th and 7th place people in the industry kind of falling off. The duopoly, at least as far as the traditional game, is going to stay where it is. And it's going to be an interesting time. It's going to grow. It's going to be very interesting, and yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yep, I would echo what everyone has said. I think that there'll be a lot of growth in the industry, definitely on the content side, because right now, we've seen a lot of growth from the big media players covering fantasy in general, but not taking the sort of specificity approach around daily. And I think there'll definitely be some voices that emerge in that space that become like sort of the go-to guys for a more casual audience to get the right kind of advice, similar to the Matthew Berrys and the Brad Evans and Funstons of the world, who have become sort of minor celebrities within the season-long fantasy space. So the content will definitely be there. I think there'll be a lot of evolution around products that appeal to more casual fans, as we alluded to earlier. I think Jeremy's definitely right around mobile, and sort of how people want to integrate daily fantasy into their lives has to be the right game format that works well on the right platform, which right now is obviously mobile, could become a watch or anything else in the future. But I think that the growth of the industry will continue. It'll definitely be very interesting to see what game formats outside of just the cell cap start to appeal to a broader audience. I think that's where there'll be a lot of growth and excitement. But again, FanDuel and DraftKings will continue to grow. They'll continue to attract a lot of investments. It'll be interesting to see, those two companies go head-to-head to figure out how they can sort of, continue to grow the market with the team deals and with everything else they're doing.
Well, you heard it here first. There's going to be a lot of growth. Every single state is going to legalize fantasy, and Jeremy and David's companies are going to be acquired for billions of dollars. So,
excellent.
Well, again, thanks to everybody for being involved in this Google Plus Hangout. It was a blast. Hopefully, everybody that was listening and watching in is now better educated about the daily fantasy sports space. Thanks to Jeremy, Nick, David, Howard. And I wish everybody a great day and a great year, and that you have much success playing daily fantasy sports.
Thanks, Darren.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.